Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. In recent days, the Institute for the Study of War has published some rather interesting information. The Rosgvardia, Russia's National Guard, would now be under the guide of Russia's General Staff of the Armed Forces, and precisely under Putin lawyers Valery Gerasimov. That information was since retracted by the ISW, but this does not mean we should not take a look at the Rosgvardia more deeply. The Kremlin is no longer pretending that internal security and external war are separate problems, you see. When riot troops and emergency services are taking part in the war in Ukraine and are even given tanks to be used there, well, tell me this does not mean the regime is planning for instability at home. Without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
When Vladimir Putin created the Rosgvardia in 2016, it was presented as an internal security force designed to ensure stability after mass protests. A decade later, the force is beginning to look less like a riot control formation and more like a parallel army. Under its longtime chief, Viktor Zolotov, a former presidential bodyguard, Rosgvardia has steadily accumulated both manpower and equipment. Over the past 2 years, it has begun to acquire more tanks, anti-tank guns, self-propelled artillery, and multiple launch rocket systems. It has also absorbed special units from the Interior Ministry. Zolotov has pledged further expansion, including maintaining close control in Russian-occupied regions of Ukraine. The acceleration followed the June 2023 Wagner mutiny, when columns of mercenaries in tanks advanced towards Moscow. Rosgvardia's trajectory reflects a system increasingly preoccupied with control, both within its borders and beyond.
And now we're zoning in on the east-splaining portion of our show. Rosgvardia's role is not limited to the Russian soil. The force has also been on the ground in occupied regions of Ukraine. In 2024, around 35,000 troops from Rosgvardia were reportedly deployed to Russian-occupied parts of the country. So let's take a closer look at Rosgvardia's influence in Ukraine.
Rosgvardia's primary tasks in the occupied regions reportedly center on counterinsurgency and control. The force also works to identify resistance networks and patrol cities and armored vehicles. The units are reportedly equipped with tanks, artillery systems, helicopters, and armored vehicles. Ukrainian sources argue that such firepower is intended less for frontline combat than for deterring dissent and reinforcing Moscow's authority over the population of occupied regions. Rosgvardia personnel were also involved in guarding polling stations during the fraudulent September 2022 referendums and subsequent local elections organized by Russia in the occupied regions. Despite the security presence, resistance activity has persisted. Ukrainian officials say local activists have distributed leaflets, shared intelligence on collaborators, and in some cases helped disrupt election logistics by providing target information to Ukrainian forces.
And now, as always, it's time to examine the issue in greater detail. Picture this. It's 2016. Vladimir Putin has recently annexed Crimea, invaded eastern Ukraine, and decided his Oman riot cops, those black-clad goons, need a glow-up. So, what does he do? He creates an entirely new paramilitary force with 340,000 troops, helicopters, and its own ministry. Not under the defense ministry, mind you, no. Rosgvardia reports directly to Putin himself. Let's break this down, shall we? Rosgvardia isn't just cops on steroids. It's a Frankenstein's monster stitched together from internal troops, special forces, and those riot cops who once beat protesters with batons like they were training for Russia-wide whack-a-mole championships. Putin signed it into law on the 5th of April 2016, officially, to fight terrorism and extremism. In reality, it was to crush anyone who even whispers elections. And get this, its first commander, Viktor Zolotov, Putin's former judo sparring partner and bodyguard. In 2016, he bragged on video about challenging opposition leader Alexei Navalny to a fistfight. Classy. Rosgvardia is meant to be more than loyal, funded to the tune of about $2 billion a year, with palaces for its commanders. Zolotov's got one called the Chalet, complete with helipad and stables. But Rosgvardia is not content with domestic thuggery alone. In February 2022, when the Ukraine invasion kicked off, Rosgvardia floods the streets, sealing off Moscow and St. Petersburg like it's a Black Friday sale gone horribly wrong. They arrest anyone waving a blue and yellow flag. They've got anti-terror units popping up in occupied Ukraine, like the 114th Special Purpose Center in Mariupol. They are the ones pacifying, Putin's word, the Donbass, rounding up so-called collaborators. The June 2023 Wagner Group mutiny exposed something that deeply unsettled the Kremlin. Its own internal security structures hesitated when confronted with an armed challenge from within the system. The truth is, Rosgvardia did not meaningfully confront Wagner columns moving towards Moscow. Some Wagner fighters were later absorbed into Rosgvardia itself. From the Kremlin's perspective, this was more than just failure. It was proof of unreliable loyalty. Rosgvardia's leadership then attempted to leverage the crisis and Russia's battlefield failures in Ukraine to expand its own institutional power. Anyhow, the relationship has not soured that much. In 2024, after Alexei Navalny died in a Russian prison, Rosgvardia flooded the streets once more, quashing protests before they sparked. Loyalty passed the test with flying colors. Different countries may have similar names and structures, but very different aims. In the US, the National Guard helps with hurricane aid and rescue. The Russian one helps with democracy, in the same way that bleach helps with skincare. For now, the Rosgvardia remains unreliable for anyone else, but bulletproof for the boss. And now here to shed more light on the issue is William James Dixon, Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here.
So let's talk about the Rosgvardia. And at the outset, we need to make a certain caveat. Quite a few days ago, there was a bit of a confusion generated in the media. Initially, there were reports that the command structure of the Rosgvardia would be changing, and that came from the Institute of the Study of War. However, later on, the ISW actually retracted that, saying that this stemmed from a mistranslation by its team. But still, there were some articles which were subsequently based on that and might have not incorporated this later development. So can you briefly summarize the situation as it is now with the Rosgvardia and with where it is actually heading as of now?
Well, that's correct. The important thing is to actually look at the legal text that was announced by the Kremlin at the beginning of the month. And it's clear, rather than being subordinated into the Ministry of Defense, actually it's been accelerated into a parallel structure which sits outside of the Ministry of Defense. The key individual who's in charge is the Russian National Guard's director called Viktor Zolotov, who now has overarching operational control and sits directly on the Security Council and reports directly to Vladimir Putin.
And this guy, I mean, he's a bit of an old-timer, right, in the Kremlin power structures. He has first made his name as the chief bodyguard, let's say, to Vladimir Putin at the very beginning of his term, and later on has managed to climb the ranks. So right now he has a command position, which, as you're saying, has been further reinforced and kept separate from the military command.
Yes, it's actually an incredibly important announcement that really signals that within the Kremlin, there's almost a parallel structure being created for this force. Really, Viktor Zolotov has seen the transformation of the Russian National Guard from a police force into what could be considered a rival military force that is able to fight both in Ukraine, but more importantly, it's a potential professional force that can protect Vladimir Putin against any internal adversary, including potentially any defections from the military.
And this is quite fascinating because according to reports, they have received their first tank units. Now, normally if you have riot police and stuff like that, you don't really see units like that being equipped with main battle tanks. And yet this is exactly what's happening in Russia. What do you think is the reason for this? Is the specter of the Prigozhin mutiny hovering above the Kremlin?
You're absolutely correct. Really, we need to see this in the framing of the Putin regime. The Prigozhin affair really highlighted that the current status and the current capabilities of the Russian National Guard were insufficient to potentially meet any serious internal issues that Vladimir Putin faced. Since then, we've seen an absolute transformation of this into a almost parallel structure, close to 350,000 active personnel. We know that there are cyber units, intelligence units, tank units. So this is no longer a police force. Really, what you need to think about this is akin to what's in Tehran and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. This is a Praetorian force solely reporting to Vladimir Putin. We have to think of it in the framing of it's a potential coercive structure that he can wield internally and externally.
So, and speaking of using it internally, does it mean that Putin doesn't really trust the military anymore? Is he thinking that perhaps if the war keeps dragging on, if there is more and more discontent, and we've already seen that, the Telegram being shut down because apart from being used by the military, it was also used by the internal critics of the command structure within the military itself, by the so-called Z-bloggers. Is he thinking, well, if this goes in this direction, there could be more Prigozhin-type events in the future, and I want to be safe against those. Do you think that this lack of trust stems from this sort of predictions?
We have to see this as strategic context, both in how autocrats behave in general, which is that they look to protect themselves from the elites and they look to protect themselves from any potential mass threats that might come from internal. Yes, we have to see this in the wider context of some of the other measures that have taken place. You're right to highlight the digital surveillance. There's been a string of measures over the last 12 months which have been about tightening the control and dividing the elites, as well as putting more coercive power against the masses within Russia writ large. So yes, this is a reflection of Vladimir Putin shoring up potential structures and potential forces that will help enable his regime in what will be the fourth year of the war.
Could this also be a measure against possible unrest in the regions? Quite recently on this very program, we had a conversation concerning how the local governors are forced to take the blame for the misfortunes of the entire state system, including financial issues. The local people tend to blame them and not Putin. But what if this changes? That is the question that the authorities at the Kremlin might be asking themselves. So could Rosgvardia once again be used as a tool of intimidation against these regional authorities, essentially telling them don't even think about going against our will?
Certainly, we've got to see it both in the potential for elite coups, but also these wider threats that are existing and starting to now be seen across Russia. Yes, this is a force that is professionalizing. It's also a force that is personally loyal to Vladimir Putin alone, and that can be wielded against internal threats, whether that comes from existing military forces, internal threats regarding mass uprisings, but also potential breakaway issues in the regions and the periphery of Russia. We're now entering a window of what we would classify as maximum danger. This is a war that's been dragging on now for many years and has been draining the resources of the Kremlin. It's inevitable that that will act as a accelerant to fissures across the entire governance of Russia.
Now, what about the external threats? Because we've mentioned that during this very conversation just a few moments ago. To what extent is Rosgvardia being deployed outside of Russia, and what functions does it play there?
So yes, this is quite an unusual structure. It fights potentially fights within the Russian state, as well as is actively fighting now in the Ukraine. And we know that it's actively combating in some of the fiercest fighting in areas like the Donbass. So it's becoming highly professionalized, and it's being used as, they say, shock unit, ultra loyal and well professionalized in the thick of the fighting on the front in Ukraine.
Now, according to reports from the very beginning of the war, these units were being sent into Ukraine, and they took quite a beating there because apparently Putin was not expecting Ukraine to resist at all. So he just wanted to have a loyal police force to chase down dissenters. Well, instead, he got a regular Ukrainian army fighting back. So what experience did actually the Rosgvardia earn from that particular episode?
Well, I think the experience is reflected in the decree that we've seen. The decree is quite unusual in that it gives this institution, it gives it almost mobilization authority, it gives it intelligence authority, strategic threat assessment functions, and a formalized general staff structure. It's been moved well away from being a riot police into a much more professional, regular force. So if you were asking me about their experience, that experience has been translated into a highly capable parallel military structure and military force that's now been institutionalized within Russia's structures. If it was not effective, this would not have happened.
How do you think is the military likely to react to this? From the generals to the ordinary troops, will they not have the impression that, here is a parallel unit or a parallel structure that is somehow privileged, perhaps, that might also have access to better resources? Will this go down well with the ordinary Russian troops out there in the trenches, for example?
It's hard to know that without having accurate sources and accurate information. And it's also a question of, yes, there might be discontent, but how does that discontent manifest itself? It's safe to say that we have to start thinking about this, about how Tehran in Iran managed the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, again, a parallel structure within a larger military force. Yes, it could lead to tension between the ranks as well as the military officials, both in the regular units, and potentially be a flashpoint for further division and further fracture.
What if there is a potential power struggle following the downfall, the death, or the resignation, whatever happens to Vladimir Putin in the future? Isn't this a recipe for a potential disaster? Because you might actually be creating a power center which will have ambitions of its own. And without Vladimir Putin to guide it, could it actually try and wrest the power away from any sort of legitimate successor, for example, or at least take part in a potential fight for succession in one way or another?
It certainly creates a much more volatile environment. Any succession, whether in the medium or long term, these types of parallel structures in other regimes through history have also played a volatile part of any succession plan. So you're right to assess that this makes any type of safe or peaceful transfer in the event of Vladimir Putin stepping down or moving on from his position much more volatile.
And now, when looking at this force, you already said it's 350,000 people, so really considerable. Where do you think is it going to evolve? How is it going to evolve in the near future? Is it going to become more of a paramilitary with some heavy equipment, like we've already mentioned, tank units? What other services or what other functions could it fulfill? Do you think that, for example, it could be equipped with anti-aircraft systems for the protection of the most closely guarded institutions or sites, locations, perhaps ones which are not officially related to the state, but residences of the president himself or of his cronies? Do you think that this perhaps could be another direction in which this institution could be evolving?
If we assume that this is about the protection of Vladimir Putin and his regime, we have to assume that there's going to be an evolution to give this unit all the capabilities and all the resources it needs to protect that regime. So you are right to indicate that potentially in the short, medium, and long term, we see this have increasing resources and potentially placements that are outside of the normal standard operating procedures of a National Guard.
William James Dixon was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. President Zelensky said on the 18th of February that Kyiv has imposed a new set of sanctions targeting Belarusian autocrat Alexander Lukashenko. This comes as Minsk reportedly allowed Russia to deploy a network of drone control relay systems in Belarus late last year.
The new sanctions from Kyiv seek to target Belarus's ability to aid Russia in its war effort, including the approximately 3,000 Belarusian firms that Zelensky alleges supply Russia with military components. Kyiv has said that new Russian drone systems in Belarus have played a critical role in facilitating strikes against energy infrastructure in northern Ukrainian regions. Additionally, the Kremlin is reportedly using Belarus as a hub to produce Oreshnik missiles, known for carrying multiple warheads that separate mid-air. This comes amid a slight thawing of relations between Belarus and the United States as Washington eased certain sanctions against Minsk.
A total of 2,000 children kidnapped by Moscow since the start of the war have been returned to Ukraine, President Zelensky said on the 17th of February. Thousands of Ukrainian children, however, remain in captivity in Russia.
Zelensky hailed the return of the children on social media, saying that significant results have been achieved. Since the beginning of Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin has been accused of forcibly transferring some 20,000 Ukrainian children to Russia. Citing these unlawful deportations, in 2023, the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for the arrest of Vladimir Putin as well as his so-called Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova. Kyiv has also accused Moscow of indoctrinating the abducted children as well as coercing them to adopt Russian citizenship and identity.
Georgia's Kulevi port on the Black Sea could face new sanctions from the European Union over allegations of transporting Russian crude. If enacted, the sanctions would also have a significant negative impact on Azerbaijan, whose state oil company owns the port through a subsidiary.
A draft from early February of the EU's upcoming 20th sanctions package revealed that the bloc is considering a ban on transactions with 4 ports believed to be used in exporting Russian crude. The Kulevi port in western Georgia is among the facilities being considered for restrictions. If approved, it would be the first time the European Union has directly targeted third country ports under sanctions against Russia. The draft alleges that the port is used in the transportation of crude oil from Russia, including by Russian ships that practice high-risk shipping practices. The plan has raised concerns in Azerbaijan, whose state oil company effectively owns the port.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news, updates and commentary.